Nancy Pelosi made a whopper of a comment on CNN accusing pro-ceasefire protesters of being Russian plants.
They're in front of my house all the time. So I have a feeling for what feelings they have. But we have to think about what we're doing. And what we have to do is try to stop the suffering in Gaza. This is women and children, people who don't have a place to go. So let's address that. But for them to call for a ceasefire is Mr. Putin's message. Mr. Putin's message. Make no mistake, this is directly connected to what he would like to see. Same thing with Ukraine. It's about Putin's message. I think some of these protesters are spontaneous and organic and sincere. Some, I think, are connected to Russia. And I say that having looked at this for a long time now, as you know.
You think some of these protests are Russian plants?
I don't think they're plants. I think some financing should be investigated. And I want to ask the FBI to investigate.
Russia, Russia, Russia. Meanwhile, John Fetterman is continuing to clash with protesters, earning him some praise from the right. Strange new respect. Now, the Pennsylvania senator waved an Israeli flag from his rooftop in response to pro-Palestinian protesters this weekend, seemingly rehashing his support for Israel in opposition to progressive critics.
Fetterman, Fetterman, you can't hide! You're supporting genocide! 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 Fetterman, you can't hide! You're supporting...
Since June of last year, Fetterman's Senate approval rating has actually jumped 6 points from 39 to 45, 4 of those points coming since this past October, the same month that Hamas carried out the Israel attack. Some online commentators noted seemingly that this flies in the face of claims that supporting Israel is a liability for Democrats.
You know, I think it is a liability for Democrats. I think that people who did not like Fetterman because he is a Democrat now do like him, even though they're never going to vote for him because they're not Democrats. So, you know, shoring up your support among people who aren't your base while actively antagonizing your base, we'll see how that pans out. And I also think it's worth noting that about half of that gain in approval rating happened prior to October 7th, which is largely probably because he was recuperating from his stroke and the low approval ratings that came along with people having some skepticism about whether or not he could do his job.
I was one of those people, but he does sound a lot better.
So you're the approval. You're the guy who is now like, okay, he's getting his mental faculties back, and I mean, I don't know how you feel about his position on Israel, but
yeah,
that's that. But are someone like you gonna vote for Fetterman over whoever his opponent is 5 years from now?
It would depend who the libertarian candidate is in the race.
Sure.
Let's talk about Nancy Pelosi. Just an amazing comment from her.
Ooh, on many levels.
I love the idea, and then she did get some pushback there from the person interviewing her, or just like follow up, like, wait, elaborate on that thought that it's Russia. And Nancy Pelosi said, what did she say? Well, someone should do an investigation of the funding, which is kind of like a pat member of Congress. Things should be investigated. I have concerns.
Right.
I must be listened to. This goes to show you how the whole Russia election interference narrative from 2016 continues to haunt certain senior level members of the Democratic Party who have never been able to move beyond that, despite all of the subsequent reporting that I think among fair-minded people lessened the impact of Russia involvement. Yes, we know that Russia, paid for bots and made some efforts on social media, like not denying that did take place. Whether it was important or consequential has come under serious scrutiny by people who looked at the extent of the disinformation efforts on social media. The idea that just because Vladimir Putin has political aims and has ideas, and the idea that any political goal that overlaps with something that is of interest to Russia is thus illegitimate as a Putin narrative is so simplistic, is so small-brained, and yet that is the perspective of Nancy Pelosi time and time again.
Yeah, I saw some people pointing out that perhaps someone who takes so much money from interest groups, including pro-Israel interest groups, cannot fathom that someone would have an organic position on the issue that is not a result of having been funded by anybody at all, perhaps having genuine humanitarian concerns, something that she cannot quite wrap her mind around. Glenn Greenwald pointed out that her statement was so outrageous that even the New York Times used language that's normally reserved for Donald Trump to talk about Nancy Pelosi's statements there. They wrote, they used in the first paragraph describing the story, the phrase, suggesting without evidence that some activists may have ties to Russia and President Vladimir Putin. Getting pushback not only, as you mentioned, from, I think it was Dana Bash in that clip, but also in the paper of record. And the part of her statement that I really don't think should be missed is when she calls on the FBI to investigate protesters. People are saying, well, remember when it was Donald Trump saying that there was going to be a Muslim ban and that we were going to surveil people in mosques after 9/11? The liberals revolted. They reacted. Understandably so. It's completely contrary to their ideals. Suddenly, now Nancy Pelosi is calling for an FBI investigation of people who are protesting a genocide that they see as being carried out with American weaponry and Democratic cover, and she wants to stick the FBI on them. Well, that doesn't exactly shore up the argument that there shouldn't be an investigation of and potential defunding of the FBI and the CIA.
Yeah, the free speech rights of Americans need to be respected. They so often aren't by the government, and again, it's just, this is such an example of the Russian interference. It was overpromised or over-predicted, the extent of it. And the reality has just not met these breathless accusations, but these breathless accusations continue. Hillary Clinton still brings them up. Nancy Pelosi still brings them up. Talking heads on MSNBC and CNN, to a much greater extent, MSNBC still bring them up. It's their entire personality. They reoriented themselves around this idea that Americans aren't capable of thinking for themselves and voting for themselves. Many of us are, because Russia has its long arm is reaching into your brains literally and filling it with wrongful information. So they turn to this on every side.
They really do.
Every time somebody does something you don't like, it's well, we can't ignore the fact that Russia is also saying things like this, and what are they funding and what are they doing?
Exactly.
It strips all human agency from people.
Exactly. One Twitter user, I loved this one, at Black Panther Babe, wrote on Twitter, the absolute nerve of Nancy insider trader Pelosi to request our finances be investigated because we're pro-Palestine. Girl, you first.
Right.
I mean, there is an incredible irony that one of the most powerful women in America has used her position to insulate herself against legislation that would cause her to be more accountable as someone in that position of power and influence, not to use that position of power to do insider trading and to self-enrich off of information that she's only supposed to be using for the benefit of the general public, of American citizens. To then say, I'm going to use my power to direct, potentially to influence the investigations that are done by the deep state to go after my political enemies. It's incredibly hypocritical and tone deaf. But I will say, I think this also speaks to the question of whether or not we should expect to see any pivot from the Democratic Party as we get closer to this election year, and as this continues to be a really alienating issue for young voters and non-white voters in particular. The base of the Democratic Party, the question is, are they going to move on this? Are you going to see any softening from Biden on Israel? When you see Nancy Pelosi doubling down with the idea that everyone who disagrees with me is a Putin agent, that does not give me confidence that there's any real substantive conversations happening within the White House.
Which is just not true. I mean, what she's claiming is not true. There's no evidence behind it. No. It's what they say about literally everything.
Correct.
As I always say, where are these misinformation people, these experts in fact-checking political statements? I'm glad to see the New York Times did note that this was nothing backing it up. We'll see if there is any more of that. More Rising right after this.